Where the engine stopped, imagine driving down a dusty road in the middle of nowhere, your heart racing, and then, bam, your car just quits on you. That's exactly what happened to Tony Stark one scorching afternoon in Willow Creek, California. Not the Tony Stark you're thinking of, all suited up in Iron Man armor, saving the world. No, this was Tony in a beat-up leather jacket, behind the wheel of his cherry red 2020 Chevrolet Corvette, trying to outrun his own thoughts. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died right there on Route 17, surrounded by endless miser tarlalura and the hum of cicadas. Tony slammed his hand on the steering wheel, muttering under his breath. He wasn't used to things breaking on him. Not cars, not plans, not his life. He stepped out, the sun burning his neck, and scanned the horizon. Nothing but fields and a faded billboard for some long-gone diner. Then he spotted it, a crooked, hand-painted sign nailed to a fence post. Hank's Garage, once Hank's Fish Bus. Tony grabbed his sunglasses, slung his backpack over his shoulder, and started walking, the gravel crunching under his boots. The garage wasn't much to look at, just a rusty shed with a tin roof sitting on the edge of Willow Creek, a sleepy town that time forgot. The air smelled like oil and old rubber. Inside, under a flickering fluorescent light, was an old man, his gray hair sticking out from under a worn cap, his hands buried in the guts of a 70s Ford pickup. This was Hank Grayson, though Tony didn't know it yet. Hank didn't look up when Tony walked in, just kept wrenching away like the world could wait. "Hey, man," Tony said, leaning against the doorframe. "My car's dead out there. Can you fix it?" Hank finally glanced up, his eyes sharp despite the wrinkles carved into his face. "What kind of car?" "Corvette, 2020. She's a beauty, but she's got a temper today." Hank let out a low whistle. "Fancy. Let's take a look." They walked back to the Corvette, Hank moving slower than Tony expected, one hand brushing his chest like he was pushing something away. Tony noticed but didn't say anything. He wasn't one for small talk. Hank just shrugged. "Ain't magic. Just know my way around an engine." He wiped his hands on a rag. "What do I owe you?" Tony asked, pulling out his wallet. Hank waved him off. "Nothing. Wasn't a big deal." Tony stared at him, not used to people turning down his money. "You sure?" Hank's eyes met his, steady and calm. "Just don't break her again." Tony nodded, climbed into the driver's seat, and pulled away, the garage fading in his rearview mirror. But something about that old man, Hank Grayson, stuck with him. It wasn't just the free fix, it was the way Hank carried himself, like he'd seen 1,000 storms and still kept his head high. What would you do if you met someone like that? Someone who didn't care about your name or your money, just did what was right? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your stories. The Ghost in the Garage. A week later, Tony Stark was back in his glossy Los Angeles penthouse, the hum of Willow Creek's dusty roads a distant memory. Meetings, tech expos, paparazzi flashing cameras in his face. It was the life he knew, the one he'd built. But every night when the city lights blurred outside his window, his mind drifted back to that rusty garage and Hank Grayson's steady eyes. Something about that old man wouldn't let go, like a song stuck in your head you can't shake. On a whim, Tony canceled his Saturday plans. No driver, no entourage, just him and his Corvette. He drove east, past the glitz of LA, through the sprawling suburbs, until the roads got narrow and the billboards faded. By dusk, he was back in Willow Creek. The garage looked even smaller in the fading light, its tin roof glowing orange under the California sun. But something was wrong. The doors were shut tight, a rusty chain looped through the handles. No hum of tools, no flicker of lights, just silence. Tony got out, his boots kicking up dust. A yellowed note was taped to the door, flapping in the breeze. He stepped closer, his heart sinking as he read the words. Closed for health reasons. Hank. Tony's jaw tightened. He remembered that moment. Hank's hand brushing his chest, the flicker of pain he'd ignored. He should have said something. He didn't. Just as he turned to leave, a voice called out from across the street. "You the guy with the fancy car?" An older woman, maybe in her 60s, stood there wiping her hands on an apron. She ran the diner next door, a place called Maggie's with neon signs and chipped coffee mugs. "I'm Clara," she said, walking over. "Hank mentioned you, said you were some big shot." "Is he okay?" Tony asked. his voice sharper than he meant. Clara hesitated, her eyes dropping to the ground. He's in St. Mary's Hospital over in Reading. Collapsed right here in the garage a few days ago. One of his regulars found him. Tony felt like someone had punched him in the gut. Why didn't he get help sooner? Hank's stubborn as a mule, Clara said with a sad smile. Always said as long as he could hold a wrench, he was fine. Tony nodded, but inside, he was burning. Hank had fixed his car for nothing, no strings attached, and now he was lying in a hospital bed alone. Tony wasn't about to let that slide. He thanked Clara, got back in his Corvette, and peeled out toward Reading, the engine roaring like it was carrying his guilt. St. Mary's was a squat brick building, all sterile hallways and the sharp smell of antiseptic. Tony strode through the doors. No suit, no sunglasses, just a guy with a mission. The nurse at the desk recognized him instantly. Hard not to, but she kept it cool. "Looking for Hank Grayson?" she asked, tapping her keyboard. "Room 204. He's stable, but don't expect too much." Tony took the elevator, his reflection staring back at him in the shiny doors. For once, he didn't feel like the guy who could fix anything. The hallway to room 204 was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your thoughts scream. He knocked softly and pushed the door open. Hank lay there, pale as the sheets, tubes snaking from his arm. A heart monitor beeped steadily. He looked smaller, like the life was draining out of him. Then his eyes fluttered open, and he saw Tony. "Well, damn," he croaked, his voice rough. "Your car break again already?" Tony cracked a smile, but it hurt. "Nah, she's purring like a kitten. Thanks to you." Hank managed a weak grin. "Guess I still got it then." Tony pulled up a chair, the legs scraping the floor. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The beeping filled the silence. Then Tony leaned forward, his voice low. "Why didn't you tell anyone you were sick?" Hank shrugged barely. "What's the point? I'm 70, lived my life, fixed what I could." Tony's hands clenched. "You fixed more than cars, Hank. You fixed, I don't know, something in me." Hank's eyes softened just for a second before he looked away. "Don't go getting soft on me, kid." But Tony wasn't backing down. He'd built empires, saved the world. But this was personal. He wasn't going to let Hank's story end in a hospital bed. Have you ever met someone who changed you, even if they didn't mean to? Someone who made you want to be better? Tell me about it in the comments. I'm reading every one. A spark in the silence. Tony Stark sat by Hank Grayson's hospital bed in St. Mary's, the heart monitor's steady beep cutting through the quiet like a metronome. Outside, Reading's skyline was fading into a dull purple, but Tony barely noticed. Hank's words, "I'm 70, lived my life," kept echoing in his head, and they stung. Tony had built towers, suits, empires, but he'd never faced something like this. A man who'd given everything and asked for nothing, now slipping away. "You don't get it, Hank," Tony said, his voice low, almost pleading. "You're not just some guy fixing cars. You're like the heartbeat of that town." Hank chuckled, but it turned into a cough. "Heartbeat, huh? Tell that to this ticker." He tapped his chest weakly. "It's running on fumes." Tony leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Then let me help. Whatever you need. Doctors, money, you name it." Hank's eyes narrowed. "I don't want your cash, Stark. Never did." He paused, his breath shallow. "You want to do something? Don't let my garage rot. That place, it's more than metal and grease. It's where I taught kids like Tommy, kids with nothing, how to build something real." Tony's mind flashed to the garage. Its rusty tools, the smell of oil, the way Hank's hands moved like they knew every engine by heart. "Tommy?" he asked. "Old apprentice," Hank said, his voice softer now. "Came from a rough spot. No family, no future. But he listened, learned. Now he's got his own shop in Sacramento. That's what that garage does. It gives people a shot." Tony sat back, the weight of it hitting him. Hank wasn't just fixing cars. He was fixing lives. One wrench at a time. And now that garage was locked up, gathering dust while Hank lay here. Tony's jaw clenched. He wasn't going to let that happen. "I'm not letting your story end, Hank," he said, his voice steady. "Not like this." Hank looked at him, his eyes tired but curious. "What are you planning, kid?" Tony didn't answer right away. An idea was forming, not some flashy Stark Industries project, but something real, something that'd make Hank proud. "You'll see," he said, a spark in his eyes. "Just hang in there." The next morning, Tony was back in Willow Creek, standing in front of Hank's garage. The chain was still on the door, but he could almost hear the clank of tools inside, like the place was begging to come back to life. He pulled out his phone and started making calls, not to CEOs or tech moguls, but to local contractors, a carpenter named Pete, and Clara from Maggie's Diner, who knew everyone in town. Clara met him at the diner, sliding a chipped mug of black coffee across the counter. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" she asked, her apron smudged with flour. "Turning Hank's place into what, exactly?" "A training shop," Tony said, his voice firm, "for kids like Tommy. Kids who need a chance to learn, to work with their hands, to feel like they matter." Clara studied him, then nodded. "Hank'd like that. But it ain't gonna be easy. This town's skeptical of big ideas." "Let 'em be skeptical," Tony said, a grin creeping in. "I've faced worse." By noon, Pete the carpenter and a couple of locals, Ellen, a retired teacher, and Javier, a mechanic who'd trained with Hank years ago, were at the garage sizing it up. Javier ran his hand along a workbench, his eyes distant. "Hank taught me everything," he said quietly. "Said a good mechanic listens to the engine, not just fixes it." Tony nodded, feeling the weight of what he was starting. This wasn't just about reopening a garage. It was about keeping Hank's heart beating, even if his body couldn't. What would you do to keep someone's legacy alive? Have you ever fought for something bigger than yourself? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm dying to know. The heart of the garage. Tony Stark stood in the middle of Hank Grayson's garage, the smell of oil and rust wrapping around him like an old blanket. It was a Saturday morning in Willow Creek, and the California sun poured through the open doors, lighting up the dusty tools and worn benches. The chain was gone now, thanks to Pete the carpenter, and the place was buzzing with a small crew. Clara from Maggie's Diner, Javier the mechanic, and Ellen the retired teacher, all rolling up their sleeves to bring the garage back to life. But Tony could still feel Hank's absence, like a missing gear in an engine. "This place hasn't seen a crowd like this in years," Javier said, hauling a box of old wrenches to a shelf. His voice was warm, but his eyes were heavy. "Hank'd be grumbling about us messing up his system." Tony smirked, picking up a greasy screwdriver. "Yeah, he'd probably tell me I'm holding this wrong." Ellen laughed, her gray hair tied back as she swept the floor. "Hank always said, you don't just clean a shop, you honor it. That's what we're doing here, Tony. For him." Tony nodded, but his chest felt tight. He'd spent days on the phone, pulling strings to get permits, supplies, and even a meeting with Willow Creek's mayor, a no-nonsense woman named Ruth who'd eyed him like he was selling snake oil. "A training shop for kids?" she'd asked, arms crossed. "In this town? You sure you're not just chasing headlines, Mr. Stark?" "I'm not here for the spotlight," Tony had told her, his voice steady. "I'm here because Hank Grayson deserves it." Ruth had stared at him, then finally nodded. "All right, but keep it real. This town don't trust fancy." Now, as Tony looked around the garage, he felt the weight of that promise. This wasn't about throwing money at a problem. It was about building something that'd last, something that'd carry Hank's spirit. He grabbed a rag and started wiping down a workbench, his hands moving slower than usual, like he was trying to soak in every moment. Clara walked over, a tray of iced tea from the diner in her hands. "You're awful quiet, Stark," she said, setting the tray down. "What's cooking in that head of yours?" Tony paused, the rag still in his hand. "Just thinking about Hank. How he did all this, fixed cars, taught kids, kept this town going, and never asked for a pat on the back. I've got the world's eyes on me every day, and I've never come close to that." Clara's face softened. "Hank wasn't perfect, but he was good. And you're doing good by him now." Before Tony could answer, Javier called out from the back. "Yo, Tony, come check this out." He was holding a small, beat-up notebook, its leather cover cracked and faded. "Found it in Hank's toolbox. Looks like he wrote in it." Tony took the notebook, his fingers brushing the worn edges. On the cover, in faint ink, were the words, "Hank's Notes, Life and Engines." He opened it, and there it was. Hank's scratchy handwriting, spilling out lessons that hit like a punch. A good mechanic don't just fix what's broke. He sees what's worth saving. Teach a kid to hold a wrench right, and you've given him a future. Tony's throat tightened as he read the last line on the page. When it's time to go, leave something behind that keeps turning. He closed the notebook, his eyes burning. Hank had known his time was short, and he'd left this behind, a map to his heart. Tony looked up at Javier, Clara, and Ellen, their faces quiet, waiting. This shop's not just gonna reopen, he said, his voice low but fierce. It's gonna be a place where kids like Tommy learn to build their lives, Hank's way. Javier nodded, his jaw tight. For Hank. For Hank, Ellen echoed, her voice cracking. Tony slipped the notebook into his pocket. He wasn't just fighting for a garage anymore. He was fighting for every kid who'd walk through that door, for every lesson Hank had left behind. And deep down, he was fighting for himself to prove he could be more than the guy in the headlines. What's something you fought to keep alive? A memory? A place? A person's dream? Share it in the comments. Your stories keep this going. The engine starts again. The sun was high over Willow Creek, painting the old garage in a warm golden glow. It was early April, and Tony Stark was elbow deep in the case of turning Hank Grayson's rusty shop into something new. The place was alive now, hammers banging, shelves going up, and the smell of fresh paint mixing with the familiar tang of motor oil. Clara was sorting tools, Javier was testing an old engine hoist, and Ellen was sketching out a training plan for the kids they'd soon bring in. But Tony's mind was somewhere else, back in St. Mary's Hospital with Hank. He'd visited Hank that morning, bringing a plain black coffee, no sugar, just how the old man liked it. Hank was sitting up in bed, looking a little less pale but still fragile, like a spark plug that could give out any second. "You're wasting your time on me, Stark," Hank had grumbled, but his eyes lit up when Tony told him about the garage. "A training shop, huh? Better not turn it into some shiny tourist trap." "Wouldn't dream of it," Tony had said, grinning. "It's gonna be real, Hank. Your way." Now, standing in the garage, Tony pulled Hank's notebook from his pocket and flipped it open. Those words, "Teach a kid to hold a wrench right, and you've given him a future," felt like a promise he couldn't break. He was about to tuck it away when Javier called him over. "Tony, you gotta see this." In the corner under a tarp was an old toolbox, dented and scratched but polished like it was loved. Javier opened it, revealing a set of wrenches, each one engraved with HG 78. Hank's dad gave him these, Javier said, his voice thick. He used to say they were his good luck charms. Tony ran his fingers over the cold metal, his throat tight. This wasn't just a toolbox. It was Hank's life, his heart, his fight. "We're putting this front and center," Tony said, his voice low, "where every kid who walks in can see it." By afternoon, the crew had made real progress. The garage had a new sign out front, hand-painted by a local kid named Miguel, Willow Creek Training Shop, Estinated 2020. It was simple, no frills, just like Hank would have wanted. Tony was helping Miguel touch up the letters when Clara rushed in, her face pale. "Tony, it's Hank. Hospital just called. He's taken a turn." The world seemed to stop. Tony's hands froze, paint dripping from the brush. "What do you mean a turn?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "They didn't say much," Clara said, her eyes wet. "Just we should get there. Now." Tony didn't wait. He grabbed his keys, jumped into the Corvette, and tore down Route 17 toward Redding, Clara and Javier piling in behind him. The drive was a blur, the Messer Tarlalura whipping past, his heart pounding louder than the engine. He kept seeing Hank's face, those sharp eyes, that stubborn grin, and the thought of losing him now, before the shop was finished, felt like a betrayal. At St. Mary's, they found Hank in room 204, his breathing shallow, the heart monitor slower than before. Tony stood by the bed, his hands clenched. "Come on, old man," he said, his voice cracking. "You gotta see what we're building. It's yours." Hank's eyes fluttered open, just a sliver. "You're a pain in my ass, Stark," he whispered, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "But you're doing good." Tony swallowed hard, tears burning his eyes. He wasn't Tony Stark, the billionaire or the hero right now. He was just a guy, begging his friend to hold on. "Don't you dare check out on me," he said. "We're not done." Hank's hand twitched, like he wanted to reach out, but he was too weak. "Keep it turning," he murmured, echoing his notebook. Then his eyes closed, and the room went quiet except for the beep of the monitor. Tony stood there, frozen, as Clara put a hand on his shoulder. "He's still here," she said softly, "and he's counting on you." Tony nodded, but inside he was breaking. He wasn't going to let Hank down. Not now, not ever. That garage, those kids, that toolbox, it was all for Hank, and Tony would fight like hell to make it real. Have you ever had to fight for someone who couldn't fight for themselves? What kept you going? Drop your story in the comments. I'm all ears. The last wrench. The Willow Creek training shop was nearly ready, its walls fresh with paint, tools gleaming under the April sun. Kids, some from tough backgrounds, others just lost, worked on engines, guided by Javier. Tony Stark watched, Hank Grayson's notebook heavy in his pocket. The sign read, "Hank Grayson Training Shop, more than machines, a promise to keep Hank's heart alive." But Hank was fading in St. Mary's Hospital. Tony visited, bringing black coffee, no sugar. Hank's voice was weak. "Shop ready?" he rasped. "Ready for you," Tony said, his throat tight. "Your toolbox is front and center." Hank's eyes flickered. "Don't let it stop, Stark," he whispered, his hand squeezing Tony's. Then the heart monitor flatlined. Nurses rushed in, but Hank was gone. Tony sat, frozen, tears falling as Clara hugged him. "He saw what you did," she said softly. At Hank's farewell, the town gathered by his bench, his toolbox polished and proud. Tony's voice broke as he spoke. "Hank showed us what matters. Fixing what's broken, giving chances." A kid named Sarah held Hank's wrench, vowing to keep learning. Tony felt Hank's spark in every clank, every kid. Ever lost someone who changed you? How do you carry them forward? Drop it in the comments. The spark lives on, fall painted Willow Creek gold, and the Hank Grayson training shop was alive with kids learning, laughing, tools clanging. Tony Stark stood by Hank's bench, coffee from Maggie's diner in hand, watching Sarah teach a shy kid named Malik how to fix a spark plug. This was Hank's legacy, thriving. A pickup rolled up, and out stepped Tommy Delgado, Hank's old apprentice. "Hank saved me," he told Tony, eyes wet. "Now I've got my own shop in Sacramento. This place, it's him." He joined the kids, showing them a trick with a timing belt. Tony opened Hank's notebook, reading, "A good mechanic sees what's worth saving." He added, "We carry the spark." "Tas," Sarah approached, holding Hank's wrench. "I'm starting a repair van," she said. "Hank'd approve?" "He'd be proud," Tony said, his eyes burning. The shop was Hank's heart, but it was Tony's promise. LA called, but Tony stayed, knowing this was where he belonged, with kids who carried Hank's spark. What promise have you kept for someone you loved? Share it in the comments. Hit subscribe to keep Hank's story alive.